In this video, I'll talk about how to judge quality of evidence in evidence-based decision-making. The term of evidence has been used so frequently in education that it sometimes loses its original meaning. The term of evidence-based decision-making came from the medical field. For example, doctors' decisions should be made based on evidence instead of their own personal experience. The fundamental principle of evidence-based decision-making is that not all evidence is created equal. There is high-quality evidence and there is low-quality evidence. How to judge the quality of evidence? We use a pyramid known as evidence-based pyramid. At the top of the pyramid is the evidence that has the highest quality. This level of evidence are the findings of meta-analysis and systematic reviews. Systematic reviews are a type of review that uses repeatable analytical methods to collect secondary data and analyze them. To conduct systematic reviews, you identify and synthesize data that are directly related to a research question. While some people might associate systematic review with meta-analysis, there are multiple types of review which can be defined as systematic, which do not involve a meta-analysis. Here is an example of a systematic review. In this article, authors described how they identified, screened, and reviewed the articles on a specific type of personal and professional development practice, which is executive coaching. They searched literature database and started with 110 articles on executive coaching. They then explained what inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria were applied to screen the articles, how those criteria were developed, and how they ended up with reviewing 84 studies. Here is another example of systematic review. In this article on abusive supervision, authors provided a comprehensive catalog of the correlates of abusive supervision. That comprehensive catalog included the antecedents, outcomes, mediators, and moderators that had been studied on the topic of abusive supervision. A meta-analysis is a statistical analysis that combines the results of multiple scientific studies. Meta-analysis can be performed when there are multiple scientific studies addressing the same question, with each individual study reporting measurements that are expected to have some degree of error. An example is a meta-analysis review of research on influence tactics. In this meta-analysis review, authors investigated the effectiveness of 11 influence tactics. Specifically, the authors investigated the relationship between each of those 11 influence tactics and task-oriented and relations-oriented outcomes. Here are the 11 influence tactics investigated by the authors. Rational persuasion involves using logical argument and explanations to persuade you. Exchange tactic is characterized by the offer of rewards for performing a favor or complying with a request. If you do A, then I'll return B to you. Inspirational appeal tactic means I arouse your enthusiasm by appealing to your values and ideals or by enhancing your confidence. To be an effective appeal, I must have insights into your values, aspirations, and ideals. Apprising is the practice of explaining how doing what I ask will produce personal benefit or help you advance your career. Apprising tactic is similar to rational persuasion. How to differentiate them? There is an important difference between uprising and rational persuasion in respect of their mediating processes. Uprising generally focusing on tangible benefits, which are part of extrinsic motivation, whereas rational persuasion focuses on intrinsic motivation. Collaboration is characterized by the offer to provide necessary resources and assistance if you approve my proposal or carry out my request. Ingratiation tactic is a practice of making you feel better before or during an influence attempt. It often takes a form of flattery and praise. Consultation tactic means I seek your participation in planning an activity or change. Personal appeals tactic is the practice of appealing to you by promoting a feeling of friendship or loyalty before I ask you to do something. Usually, my request to you is not part of your regular job responsibilities. Legitimating tactic means I seek to establish the appropriateness of my request or to verify the authority to make my request. With this tactic, I warrant my request by appealing to official policies. I can also warrant my request by highlighting our hierarchical positions, such as pointing out I outrank you. Coalition tactic means seeking help from you to do something. Pressure tactic is the use of demand, threats, continual checking, and repeated reminders to influence you to carry out my request. To find the literature for meta-analysis, the authors conducted an extensive literature search for both published studies and unpublished studies, including doctoral dissertations that examined the relationship between each influence tactic and its effectiveness. The literature searches resulted in the identification of 127 published studies and 74 unpublished doctoral dissertations. The authors then calculate the weighted mean correlation. To test moderating effects, the authors grouped studies into subcategories and computed a weighted average reliability corrected correlation for each moderator subset. What are the results of the meta-analysis? Regardless of task-oriented or relations-oriented outcomes, the results showed that the most effective tactics were rational persuasion, inspirational appeal, uprising, collaboration, ingratiation, and consultation. The least effective tactic was pressure, and rational persuasion is the only tactic which held stable, positive relationships with both categories of outcomes, regardless of moderating factors. Another example of meta-analysis is the study of destructive leadership and its outcomes. In this study, authors analyzed 57 studies on the relationship between destructive leadership and its outcomes. Destructive leadership is the systematic and repeated behavior by a leader, supervisor, or manager that violates the legitimate interest of the organization by undermining and sabotaging the organization's goals, tasks, resources, and effectiveness, and the motivation, well-being, and job satisfaction of subordinates. The results of this meta-analysis suggest that the highest correlation arises between destructive leadership and attitudes towards the leader, for example, low trust in destructive leaders. The next highest correlation was the relationship between destructive leadership and counterproductive work behavior. Here, counterproductive work behavior means purposeful behavior that violates organizational norms and is intended to harm the organization. For example, you purposefully extend overtime. You can't direct your anger at your boss, so you become aggressive to your subordinates. Counterproductive work behavior is safer for employees than direct resistance toward the destructive leaders, which can be considered as insubordination and grounds for employment termination. Next to the top of the pyramid is the evidence from randomized controlled trials and experiments. A randomized controlled trial is a form of scientific experiment used to control factors not under direct experimental control. If you want to study whether an intervention works or not, you randomly assign research participants into an experimental group or a control group. This is the most rigorous way of determining whether a cause-effect relationship exists between the intervention and an outcome. Unfortunately, there are almost no double-blind randomized controlled experiments in the field of educational leadership. Without this gold standard of evidence-based research aimed at answering what works, the quality of evidence suffers in making the so-called evidence-based decisions. The third level of evidence is the evidence from non-randomized controlled trials or experiments. The difference between randomized controlled experiments and non-randomized controlled experiments is how you assign research participants. Many leadership research on whether an intervention is effective or not is non-randomized experiments. For practical reasons, it is sometimes very difficult to randomly assign your research participants a leadership role at their workplaces. The fourth level of evidence is observational studies with comparison groups. Here you have at least two groups, one of which serves as a comparison group. There may be no intervention involved. You simply observe different groups. The fifth level of evidence is from case series and case reports. The evidence includes detailed reports of one case or multiple cases under investigation. The details of each case are rich, but the generalizability of the evidence is very limited. At the bottom of the pyramid is expert opinions. You interview and observe some experts who have remarkable achievement of your topic of interest. You uncover their perceptions and opinions, but you cannot generalize the evidence to other contexts. In this evidence-based pyramid, the quality of evidence increases from bottom to top. In evidence-based decision-making, the evidence at the top two levels are considered reliable. The evidence at the bottom two levels are considered unreliable. When you look for evidence, you should start with high-quality evidence on the top of the pyramid. You only go to the next level of evidence when the high-quality evidence is not available. Even when you can find the evidence from meta-analysis studies and systematic reviews, you still need to be cautious. Quality of evidence needs to be downgraded if there are limitations in study design or implementation, wide confidence intervals, variability in results, indirectness of evidence, or publication bias. Publication bias is a bias in published academic research literature. Ideally, you may think you publish whatever results you get, regardless of your results supporting or refuting your theories or hypotheses. But that's not the case. The outcomes of your research study greatly influence whether an academic journal publishes your research or not. Have you ever noticed that most of the literature you've ever read reported positive results? That's publication bias. It's not that negative results don't exist. It's only because they're not published. If negative results don't get published, you only get one-sided information. The publication bias also influences your evidence-based decision-making. Abraham Flexner was an American educator, best known for his role in the 20th century reform of medical and higher education in the United States and Canada. In his article, The Usefulness of the Useless Knowledge, written in 1939, he described the science as the Mississippi. Science, like the Mississippi, begins in a tiny rivulet in the distant forest. Gradually, other streams swell its volume, and the roaring river that bursts the dikes is formed from countless sources. You cannot say that you make your decisions based on scientific evidence when you consider only one-sided evidence. Another problem with evidence-based decision-making is usually not the lack of evidence. The problem is that decision-makers don't know how to find evidence. I did a search on Google Scholar. There were over 76,000 articles on educational leadership published since 2021. That was about 208 articles on the topic of educational leadership that were published every day in 2021. Not all evidence reported in those articles is created equal. In front of this sea of evidence, it is particularly important for you to learn how to evaluate the quality of evidence. According to the evidence-based decision-making, the high-quality evidence is not a few experts' opinions, perceptions, and intuitions, but the evidence systematically synthesized from all studies available.